So hi everyone. So I'm gonna talk about transnational queer feminist methodologies in live art and the work of Va Bene Lichem Piazzi. Va Bene, also known as Crazinist Artist, is an openly transgender performance and visual artist based in Kumasi, Ghana, who works on an international scale. Her live art practice involves endurance and durational body-based performances that engage and challenge the public with unsettling representations of violence and oppressions experienced through gender, sexual, and racial stigmas. Her bio openly challenges the most accepted conventions for the use of pronouns, declaring she, it is Va Bene Lichem Piazzi's Crazinist Artist biopolitical pronoun. Anyone or any institution can responsibly use any pronoun of their preference, otherwise just use shit and shits. The same word crazinist artist appropriates an offense of insanity as a self-identification. In the performance Wounded Wound, which she performed for the first time in Amsterdam, she enters the space fully dressed in female clothes that she slowly removes and drops on the floor of the stage. She then kneels down onto a toilet that is revealed at the center of the stage and repetitively immerses her head inside it, removing female clothes drenched in a pale yellow liquid. The artist describes this performance as a healing process, created through the struggle against one's ego, in which the audience is asked to experience an unpleasant condition of life, future, survival, and a sense of recovery. More specifically, through this performance, the artist wants us to understand the struggles of inhabiting trans or gender non-conforming bodies and how these manifest in racially marked subjects. When seeing this work for the first time, I was unable to read the healing process in the deeply unsettling and degrading actions of the artist. But then I realized that as she chokes her face in the overflowing toilet, Va Bene is summoning us into an act of healing that is not administered as a cure. Wounded Wound does not offer a prescriptive narrative of redemption for the performer or the public, and the actions conclude with unresolved feelings of exhaustion and inadequacy. Feelings that are highlighted by the global north privileged position of the viewers in relation to the artist's Black African body. Then, if the artist does not provide a legible solution to the oppression of the LGBT Black subjects, maybe it's the ugly feelings triggered by her actions that can generate healing as a complex affective relational process. Through the work of Va Bene Lichem Piazzi, I want to examine how queer feminist performance from a transnational perspective produces complex identifications that are not immediately legible through an LGBT rights framework or identity politics. Queer studies as a discipline has been accused by scholars from across the globe for perpetuating discourses that have been framed within a universalizing Anglo-American perspective. As Douglas Clark notes in the Queer African Reader, the consequences of the exclusion and erasure of African sexualities from Western queer theory has been devastating, with whole identities not being accepted or allowed to contribute to what has become a queer theory canon. However, queer theory was created to be a vibrant transnational field of study, as I will show. When US-based Italian feminist scholar Teresa De Laurentiis coined the term queer theory in 1990, she aimed at exploring discourses and practices of homosexualities in relation to gender and to race, with their attendant differences of class or ethnic culture, generational, geographical, and socio-political location. Whilst the entanglement with intersectional feminism were an integral part of queer theory's initial pronouncements, a predominant focus on homosexual white Western identities soon obfuscated its critical influence. Shortly, a small number of US-based figures became exemplary for the whole field of study, and we can indeed think of many queer theory superstars nowadays. The knowledge produced in this context has been then adopted universally without acknowledging its own socio-cultural specificities. In the years following its academic birth, many well-known gender and sexuality theorists, including the same De Laurentiis, declared their discontent with the use of queer and highlighted the need for a change of direction to avoid the stagnation or even death of the discipline. This trajectory has been followed by Eng, Alberstam, and Munoz, when in the wake of the US war on terror, they posed the question, what's queer about queer studies now? Or when David Ruffolo in 2009 proposed to speak about a post-queer approach. This same queer inquietude has resurfaced in the few past years, fraught with identity politics and hypervisibility issues, with the confrontations of colonial legacies or the climate crisis or the shift to the digital. My proposal for both queer studies and the inherently queer field of live art is not to dismiss the use of queer as an unproductive analytical category, but rather to forcefully and continuously reorient and expand our praxis towards the never-ending differences, tensions, and relations that De Laurentiis started to outline back in the 90s. The complexities of queer and feminist artistic expressions situated outside of Euro-American contexts have rarely been appreciated, explored, or accounted for. In the global north, queer art from outside of specific Western geographies have often been excluded, under-researched, or turned into a token for ethnic diversity. Other factors have contributed to the scarce visibility of artists from less privileged locations, such as the lack of public funding in those locations, the effect of local politics or traditions on queer feminist arts, the scarce institutional support, or even recognizing performance art as a legitimate area of study and artistic discipline. These issues make even more urgent the need to develop a sustainable and transnational network by supporting queer and feminist artistic productions in less privileged geopolitical areas. In 2016, Amelia Jones and Irene Silver wrote as a caveat in their co-edited book, Otherwise, Imagining Queer Feminist Art Histories, we leave aside in this volume the crucial and massive problem of how to understand issues of sexuality and gender in non-European based cultures. So my own research aims to take up these crucial issues and develop a culturally sensitive method for approaching queer live art across various geographies, and by keeping in mind that underrepresented practices also exist in culturally hegemonic geographies. To achieve this, I believe that a transnational queer feminist methodology is essential to infuse queer studies with their initial critical potential. The definition of transnational that I employ is indebted to women of color like Gloria Zaldúa and Chandra Talpade Mohanty, who since the 80s have been proposing a transborder feminism, which critically decenters Western humanism, Eurocentrism, and white Western feminism. Even more so in the digital age we live in, the notion of transnational works for me as an articulation and a relation between local differences and border-crossing discourses, movements, and coalitions. This concept does not equate to an international feminism that is seen as rigidly adhering to nation-state borders, or to the idea of a global feminism which has been scrutinized for prioritizing northern feminist agendas and for homogenizing women's struggles. I also intend queer feminism as an umbrella term, referring to ethical political identifications situated at the convergences of queer and feminist theories and practices. While most authors write queer feminism as two separate words, I use the hyphen as a link between them to honor their historical intersections and strengthen their necessary alliances. By performing a coalitional task, the hyphen aims to reject the colonialist, racist, misogynist, homophobic, transphobic, slut-shaming, ableist, and homonationalist discourses that have characterized, even unknowingly, some strands of feminism or gay and lesbian politics. Despite its English terminology, my use of queer feminism is relinquished from its Anglo-American situatedness and it can articulate across incommensurable geopolitical and linguistic contexts. While conducting my research, I have found that the social sciences have been paying close attention to diversifying queer and feminist theories in different geographies. And therefore, I argue they can offer renewed strategies for the application of queer feminist theories in live art. In their Queer Methods and Methodologies, Brown and Nash note that there is a geography to queer thinking, theorizing, and identification that often leaves under-recognized the situatedness of academics from the global north, who become international, transcendent, and adopted, whilst those from elsewhere are bound to their location. In academia, this has often relegated non-Euro-American theories into area studies or ethnic studies domains. The expansion of queer North American theories and practices worldwide has become, on one end, an empowering identification tool for queer subjects. But on the other side, it has become an oppressive mechanism against the same-sex gender dissidents who have been accused of adopting foreign values and labels. The direct adoption of English words, terminologies, and acronyms in non-Anglo-American contexts, where these had no previous use, has reinforced the idea of foreignness and have at times overwritten pre-existing terms. My proposed transnational queer feminist methodology, which relies on an interdisciplinary weaving of social sciences, queer and performance studies, will then counteract the othering of non-Anglo-American practices and avoid making abstract equivalencies among geographically dispersed queer feminist cultures. Engaging with the work of artists like Va Bene, Licenziati, who have developed their practice at the geographic peripheries of queer and feminist discourses, whilst infiltrating them on an international scale, has been instrumental for the elaboration of this method. The endurance performance Agbano, which translates from the local Ewe language as lying in state, took place for the first time at Chalewote Street Art Festival in Accra. It unfolds in a large cubic structure in which a framed cross is held mid-air by chains. The artist lies on the cross, surrounded by long rusty metal spikes. Underneath, a musician plays funerary notes with a flute. The artist's body is still, lying supine in public display as if it was a state funeral. During a 4-hour-long action with slow movements and strenuous efforts, the artist works her way up to a vertical position by holding and pulling the chains suspended above her head. The performance, which took place at Fort James, a 17th century building used by the British to gather gold and slaves for the empire, also acts as a symbolic resurrection haunted by a dehumanizing past. The specters of colonialism and human abuses are channeled through both the architecture and craziness artist's performing body. However, the artist not only points at the human abuses perpetuated by colonizers, but also at Ghana's and generally Africa's own present responsibility in condoning violence towards marginalized individuals. And anti-LGBTQ sentiments have indeed been endorsed by the church, the local governments, and the media to coalesce the national public opinion around the scapegoating of a marginalized population. In this performance, the artist exhibits via her own body an image of sufferance reminiscent of Christ's crucifixion that challenges the viewers. But how does the public know that what we are facing is a transgender body when the latter is stripped bare and covered in clay? How much does the visibility of that body matter in this death ritual? Va Bene's face is disfigured with lumps of clay. Her skin and long braids are smeared in a thick layer of dirt. Metaphorically, and in line with Christian scriptures, clay is the element that God used to mold humankind. In Agbano, the artist uses clay to mold her queer femme body like any other body that could become a victim of civic and military brutality. Queer African activists have evidenced the problematic use of LGBTQ identity categories and the risk of segregating sexuality-based struggles from other struggles that are still inextricably connected to living as queer persons in Africa. For example, Kenyan scholar Lynn Ossom observes that from a queer African perspective, there is a danger in disengaging with notions of class, whereas sexual minority groups become particularly vulnerable to scapegoating and witch hunting during times of economic hardship. Queer African politics, hence, are concerned with placing the LGBTQ individuals back into the complex web of relations that they occupy in society. The effective web of connections rematerializes their existence within the domain of the everyday and the customary, rather than dangerously abstracting and disconnecting their lives from those of the communities they live in. In the past 2 decades, a flourishing number of queer African studies have pointed at the complex terrain that LGBTQ politics occupy within the continent. Nigerian activist Sokari Ekine affirms that 2 narratives dominate the popular conversations. One claims that queer sexualities are un-African, and the other treats Africa as a site of obsessive homophobia. These perspectives have found a fertile ground with increased religious fundamentalism and belief that pro-queer initiatives are Western and imperialist, including the work of international NGOs. And because of the colonial legacy that labeled African sexual and gender expressions as deviant by imposing Western canons to their bodies and ways of living. The live art practice of creationist artists, I contend, decolonizes gender and sexuality by representing an identity that is not indexical and by refusing the neo-colonial taxonomic classifications that her body, and by extensions, all African bodies, have been inscribed with. Her transfeminine performing body refuses to subscribe to specific visual standards the same way she refuses proper pronouns or definitions. Her body does not do what it is expected to do. Identity cannot be contained or fixed in her work, and the use of clay and the circulation of negative affects contributes to destabilizing expectations centered in neoliberal LGBT rights. Or as Leticia Alvarado says about abject performance art, it embraces affects counterintuitive to those we have been thought to regard as politically helpful. In covering, albeit not erasing, her features with clay, the artist uses the concept of human as a communication strategy that connects the historically dehumanized Black body to the experiences that LGBTQ individuals endure in various African countries these days. Her work speaks for the African queer body as one that belongs to a more complex system of relations. And her live art advances social justice from a framework of community, belonging, and solidarity, which starts from the marginalized sexual and gender identities, but does not end there. In conclusion, the use of a transnational queer feminist methodology is to seek and nourish the complexity of works that escape easy definitions, like Vabene's. It would not be indeed sufficient to employ the progress-based, the redemptive, and sex-positive narratives of Euro-American queer or feminist rights movement to describe her live art practice. And approaching queer feminist live art from a transnational perspective means that the act of translation cannot crystallize into a final product. Instead, it should persist as an ongoing, collaborative, and caring process that can be as difficult and partial as it can be transformative. Some parts of this process will have to remain illegible or untranslatable. However, it will allow for more space for interpretation and more silence to hear the artist's unique body voice utterances. Thank you.